Welcome to the recording of Sprout Labs Getting Started in Digital Learning for Trainers. This isn't a recording of the actual live session. What we do with our webinars is make them quite interactive, and we find if we record the live interactive sessions, they participate less in the whiteboard activities. So what I do is do this recording afterwards of the bits of me ranting and talking, and then also now I also do summaries of what actually happened in the interactive sessions, because there's just so much great material there. Now, to start, I'm just going to give a little bit of a quick overview of what Sprout Labs does. Essentially, we will help with organizations to design and build learning ecosystems that accelerate expertise. Generally, this means we're working with multiple parts that work together to build a whole. It's not just one bit of technology, one bit of one program, it's an interrelationship between things. We essentially work across four service areas: strategy, design and development, technologies, and implementation. We take what we call a strategy-first approach, quite often work with clients to develop a blueprint and roadmap about where they're going. And then the other bits are really about helping them implement them. We currently are not doing a lot of design and development work. We probably only have 1 or 2 slots a year to be able to do innovative design and development work. The technologies we work with are what we call next-gen technologies that support new types of approaches to blended and digital learning, namely the Totra LMS and Totra Social, which are sort of open LMSs, and Glasshouse, our next-generation authoring system. Now, because of these programs, they quite often have many moving parts, they're innovative for organizations, we also help people implement and support them through that implementation process as well. This particular on-demand webinar is really a 101. It's a basics. We're going to look at different approaches to getting started in digital learning and how different approaches affect the business model as well. Quickly look at 70-20-10 and digital learning, and we don't go into that extensively, but quite a lot around moving beyond delivering courses to really starting to move at a capability development level. You notice I'm not talking about e-learning, I'm talking about digital learning. E-learning has become sort of associated with PowerPoints and quizzes at the end. It's disengaging and people are just not interested, and it's quite often not getting the outcomes that everyone expected. At the beginning of the session, I did actually open it back up and sit there and ask, how have people learnt a skill recently? This first interactive activity was great. Got some really interesting responses, and the themes are really around a few different things. A few people talked about how they literally Googled the problem, then they watched the YouTube video, and then they experimented and gave it a try. The other big thing was this whole idea that people gave it a try. And the other one was that people actually then helped and looked for internal support and internal people to be able to help them with things as well. This is very different to the world of what we actually sometimes perceive in organizations and see in organizations, is that the notion that learning all happens in a learning management system. It's planned, it's neat, it's tidied, it's measured. It's not this sort of organic thing that's happening that people were explaining of actually how they really do learn. Sometimes people sort of think of this sort of approach as not being applicable in organizations and in workplaces. It's really the complete opposite to how workplace learning can work. The ecosystem approach can mean that you can sort of really open things up and be at a spot where you give people more choices and you build more opportunities from different types of medium and different types of channels to be able to learn in different ways. So a digital learning program might be built up of virtual classrooms, a mobile support app, resources and handbooks on the internet support, as well as a traditional learning experience. It has many moving parts that come together to build a whole. Digital learning has 3 promises and 3 possibilities: to increase flexibility for learners and organizations, so learning can be delivered faster and people can get through programs faster; increasing the effectiveness, in actual fact making it more interactive, and at the same time also decreasing the cost as well. Then actually asked everyone to actually sort of open up what were their most recent experiences of e-learning. Most people sat there and said they were disengaged, they were bored, they were frustrated. A couple of people made a really interesting observation that I'll pick up in future blog posts. That all it was content curation. It was just a whole lot of content thrown at them. They weren't really in a spot where they felt like they were going through that same experiential learning experience they did when they learned something off their own back. So what we actually have to see is that in actual fact, really, there's not a lot of benefits of digital learning. Quite often, its greatest benefit is that people can get through it faster. Rather than being dragged along to a half-day workshop, they can do an e-learning module in 40 minutes and get the content out of the way, even if it is boring. What we see is because the driving force is decreased costs, people will forget about the interactive possibilities. They forget about designing experiences and see those as expensive options and just resort back to information dumps. It's sort of interesting because I sometimes feel like I'm preaching to people who know this already, people who are learning experts, people who are instructional designers who are doing this. But it's sort of interesting to still see that people are out there producing resources that really don't have a lot of level of interaction in them. There's really two types of e-learning. I'm really not keen on these words of asynchronous and synchronous, but it's a way of organizing them. Asynchronous learning experiences are ones that people can do anytime and anywhere. They're the ones that people quite often focus on. They give people a flexibility of time and space and place. What's really interesting is synchronous things like virtual classrooms and online meetings are sometimes overlooked because they still do give really great flexibility. People no longer have to travel. And one of the really interesting things is you quite often can go from saying, oh, it's a half-day workshop to reducing it down into a smaller period of time. The other asynchronous things to think about that are actually not as complicated or as expensive as building a full self-paced module, things like social learning and discussions and collaborations. And also in this spot are a set of things that help in terms of performance support, things like ebooks and resources and mobile apps. These are sort of what I think of as learning resources rather than learning experiences. Quite often they're not interactive and you can build then interactions around them. So hinted at just there before. In some ways, getting started with virtual classrooms and synchronous learning experiences is one of the best ways to get started. It's very natural for a face-to-face trainer or facilitator to move into a virtual classroom situation and be at the spot where they can actually facilitate online fairly quickly. It's also a really great way of being able to do group coaching. One of the guidelines and tricks is to make sure the group's not too big, to reduce down the numbers, keep it small, so people will take the microphone. Because we're used to seeing big, huge webinars, which actually most people are not prepared to take a microphone in a situation where there's 50 people in the room, whether or not it's face-to-face or online. So keep your groups smaller. A little bit of quick mapping of 70-20-10 model to the ideas we've just been talking about. The 70, the notion that you can learn from experience, and this is the most powerful way of learning, can be supported by making sure people have the right set of knowledge at the right time. Also, one of the most powerful things about learning from experience is being able to reflect and articulate what you're doing. So you can do things like give people learning logs to be able to record what they're doing. These might be as simple as something like Evernote or Google Keep, where people can keep notes. They might be something like the 70-20 tool, and in actual fact, in Sprout Labs content and authoring system at the moment, we're developing a learning log feature as well. It's interesting because some of these things sort of sometimes cross over into 20 of learning from others and learning from peers, and especially your manager. And there's huge amounts of possibilities around using digital learning to build online communities in forums and blogs and comments. The 10 is sometimes seen as being the traditional bit, the bit that's actually an e-learning module that's linear, that's formal. A couple of Sprout Labs instructional designers talk about the fact that you can actually revolutionize and really change the 10 by actually making it more like the 70. By making it more interactive, more experiential based, giving more chances for people to collaborate as well. There's interesting ideas as well by the 10, which by expanding it and involving some social learning and putting workplace tasks around as well, so you can actually build spaced learning experiences that help with learning transfer as well. Now, one of the big themes I really want to talk about is a new mantra for L&D of capability development. It's interesting because essentially anytime someone mentions capability development, there's people are looking for a definition, and it can mean many different things to many different people. And essentially each organization seems to be taking their own definition for it. The definition I'm really starting to see is it's a combination of people, the traditional skills, knowledge and mindset, processes, how things are done, and also the infrastructure where things are done as well. Inside of this, inside of people, there might be rewards and organizational design as well, and that sort of crosses sometimes over into infrastructure and processes as well. But it's sort of a holistic way of working beyond courses is the way I like to think about it. Now what I'm going to do is try to bring together some instructional design processes and thinking, and actually how that works with capability development, and how that by changing some of the processes and ways you work at the beginning of doing course design work gives the ability to be able to work at that capability level. Instructional design processes have generally been organized around the ADDIE model of analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. There's a real growing movement to take design thinking and the processes around analytical thinking, empathy, and creativity, and constant testing and applying those to learning as well. It's a process Sprout Labs has been working very naturally with for a long time. As the founder of Sprout Labs, I come from a design background. For me, it was a very natural way of working, and quite often I didn't even talk about it as being ADDIE or design thinking. It was just the design process. One thing we're seeing in organizations is people are developing new products and services that are really revolutionizing how people are going about doing things by applying design thinking, by working in a really empathetic way with people. I'm actually just going to skip over the whole process at the moment, and I'm going to actually drill more into each one a little bit more after I talk about possibly, which is the most important bit, the understanding phase, how you're getting started, and the steps at the beginning. One of the things that keeps on coming up in the podcast when we talk about learning and learning design is that the analysis stage needs to be stronger. People need to be better at it. They need to think more deeply and ask different sort of questions. And I think about this sort of and the understanding phase as having three aspects: the business problem, the context the organization is in, and the learners. What's really interesting, I think one of the things that sometimes at risk with design thinking is actually overemphasizing the learner's needs and forgetting about the context and the business problem as well. For me, it's a real balancing between the whole three aspects of it. One of those tools that I think is really powerful and we've found to be really powerful is the fishbone diagram. To be able to really look at and work at with that sense of the context as well as the business problem, and to some extent the learners. This is a version of Paul Matthews' fishbone diagram. Literally what goes at the end of these changes every time we use it. So if people ask us to do a course, like we sit there and say, cool, can we just pause for a little moment, do a diagnostic session, and we get this diagram up, put it on a whiteboard, put the business problem here, and then work through each of these aspects, looking at what is affecting that business problem. What quickly becomes clear is that it's not just the skills and knowledge that people were thinking about at the beginning, the things that are in the way, that there's actually things that can be changed around measurement and resources to be able to really revolutionize and really make a real difference to things. And this sort of, by laying it all out, gives a sort of different viewpoint on it and opens up different possibilities for discussions about designing different things within the ecosystem. The interesting thing, I think, is from a training point of view, or even a L&D internally point of view, if you start sort of working with this sort of capability framework, it sort of changes some of the sort of things and processes and products you work on. Then with the group, did a couple of interactive exercises around this. And some of the things that sort of came up that people would then start to think about sort of different products and services would be different sorts of resources, things like video and building social collaboration and communities. Actually, video came up multiple times, and then also finding a different balance as well. The business model would actually then have to focus in a really different way on measuring and evaluating if you didn't actually have that direct sort of course and event and a learning experience to evaluate. And also really changing the way how you communicate to people and staff about what you actually go about doing. We quickly looked at measurement as well. And the interesting thing in the fishbone diagram and the notion of analysing the whole, quite often the measurement is about the fact that people might not be behaving in the correct way because their measurements are not quite right. That in actual fact, by changing the way people are measured and rewarded and sometimes how their effort is made visible, then changes actually their feedback loops about their behaviour as well. So some of the things that came up was going beyond measuring completions and really starting to look at business outcomes around learning and learning activities to start with and making really strong links for those. And then also changing the learning experience would actually be a greater focus on coaching for performance as well. And that really changes a lot of the narratives. What's really interesting about all of what's just been talked about is it means that as a trainer, a facilitator, a consultant, you don't just need to be building courses. There's other ways of being able to build experiences that increase people's performance and has different business models and different possibilities, including just around doing resource development and process redesign, rather than being in a spot where it's always a business model that's about time and events. Just want to return back to and work through the other aspects of the digital thinking process. So we talked about this sort of understanding bit. The bit I haven't talked about is it's really important at that understanding level from a design point of view to build a really empathetic picture and understanding of who the learners are. The next couple of stages sort of start to mix together, and they're about exploring and doing ideation work, brainstorming, trying to think through and look at what solutions might be able to be met to come out of the understanding phase. Quite often at the understanding phase, one thing that people do is end up with a whole, this person needs to be able to do ... And then as you work through these ideas, you go, okay, so that audience of Joe needs to be able to access support material on their mobile phone. What does that then mean? Joe needs to get through their compliance training faster. So what does that mean? How can we design a solution for that? Our organisation doesn't have great soft skills. What does that mean? How can we embed that into our compliance and technical training so it can really shift and move things around? Now, as well as developing ideas, sometimes this means actually starting to move into the phase that's next, the prototyping, of telling stories. How might the solution work? What might it look like by building mock-ups and prototypes? Especially if it's a solution that's a more ecosystem and a 70-20-10 solution, using stories is a really powerful way of looking at this. There's a whole discipline of design called service design, and quite often service design is one of the things that uses lots of stories to be able to explain how they're working. Also working in sort of visual maps as well to be able to map out sequences and who's doing what at particular stages is another nice way of being able to document these as well. The next sort of two phases work together, and it's sort of this notion of building a prototype and forever being in a prototyping phase where you prototype and you test and you get feedback. A couple of people, L&D people, have looked at this and done there's no implementation phase, and that's just quite deliberate because the people I see who are doing the most successful work at the moment are in a spot where they've actually got a continuous loop happening. Their learning experiences and the way they're working is not fixed, it's not implemented. It's actually in a spot where it's being trialed, being tested, being reviewed, and really starting to be at a spot where it's being evolving and evaluating all the time. In some ways, I can't really do a 101 onto digital learning without talking about who's involved in working in digital learning. Traditionally, there's been these sorts of split roles of a subject matter expert and a learning designer who really work to building a storyboard that then a group of people develop the product from, the experience from. These might be designers or developers, and sometimes they actually get split into designers that might be better at user interface and some designers that are better at working with, say, illustration. And then there might be media experts in the mix as well. Then, last but not least, but then there's the person who reviews it and just checks to make sure that the product's actually meeting the needs of everything. Now, in some ways, the person that holds all this together is actually the instructional designer, the learning designer, the person who actually has the education knowledge. They quite often have to be a sort of slight expert in all the different areas to bring all this stuff together. To not actually understand, say, how to shoot video, but to understand the potential of different types of video to build learning experiences. What we're seeing is the rise of what I call the superhuman, the person who takes all those disciplines and brings them together into one person. Especially there's this strong expectation in in-house development teams that one person can actually do everything, that they can actually take all these bits and pieces and bring them all together. And there is some people who can do this extremely well and make some great e-learning. One of the really great things about the superhuman is that quite often destroys and takes down the communication barrier, especially if they're also the subject matter expert. Essentially, they can build, design, and make it and bring it all together as one person. My comment is quite often when people ask what's involved in making great e-learning, I normally sit there and say a couple of postgraduate degrees, because that's essentially each one of our experts normally have some sort of higher qualification in their particular area. I opened up to the group to the question about what's the biggest challenge for being one of these e-learning superhumans. And some of the themes that came up really strongly was it's hard to build quality work when you're doing it all yourself and having to be pulled apart by all these areas. And then the other thing is that if you're actually an internal person working in an organization, that it's actually just really hard for people to realize just how long it actually takes to develop something. That actually being able to bring all these things together is sometimes slower than actually different groups of people working with it as well. And part of the challenge of this sort of being a superhuman is just having to know all these different areas and be an expert in everything. And that's not an easy spot to be in. Now, I've talked about essentially the role of an instructional designer, but I haven't talked about what they do. So quite often in meetings with people are getting started in e-learning, they sort of start to sit there and do a question of what does an instructional designer do? Do they put together the content? Well, no, in actual fact, what they do is they design the learning activities that help people learn. This sort of perception that they're content experts and content people who know how to display and communicate content only is one of the real problems with e-learning, and that focus on it being resources. I mean, it's essentially I've tried to distill instructional design down to a simple statement, and it's actually a complicated area. And in future webinars, I'm going to explore actually some of the changes and things that are happening around instructional design at the moment. Another theme I need to pick up in a 101 is when do you need an LMS? It's interesting because essentially quite often when people are getting started, they think exactly they need a learning management system because that's what they need to be able to build and track learning. If you're operating in a business-to-business environment, most of your clients are going to have a learning management system already. What they're probably more after is learning experiences to be able to go into the learning management system so they can then track, allocate, and work with their people over it. If you're in an environment that's doing direct delivery, like an RTO that then has lots of reporting requirements, then a learning management system will save you a whole lot of time. The thing to be aware of is that sometimes if you're a trainer or a consultant starting in digital learning, you may not actually need a full learning management system depending on who your audience is. If your audience is direct learners, then you're probably going to need a learning management system. If your audience and your market is business to business and you're selling to organizations, you might not need a learning management system. On the topic of learning management systems, there's really a new world of learning management systems developing. Ones that come from more of an educational background. The two of the big ones are Toshra LMS, Sprout Labs is a Toshra partner, and Bridge, which is based on the Canvas LMS. The thing that's a really defining factor with both of these LMSs is they have a richer set of learning tools than a traditional SCORM player, not just about self-paced e-learning. They support social learning, uploading of evidence, and support a really rich set of interactions that are more within the 20 environment than in the traditional 10. I hinted at it before, a learning management system is not always the best place to be able to develop learning experiences. In the new world of authoring e-learning, it's more like authoring a website. It's page-based, people can navigate and move around. It's not so much slide-based. People are actually allowed to be able to be more self-guided. Quite often these sort of platforms are cloud-based and you can deliver from them as well. And the examples are things like Gomo Learning, the ADAPT framework, and Sprout Labs tool, ClassHouse. Now, also part of this move is a move away from the positioning of the learning management system as being the central thing. With the adoption of a new type of reporting system called XAPI or Experience API, or sometimes known as Tin Can, it allows you to be able to collect data from lots of different spots, bring it back into a single spot. And essentially, I think of it as a hub and spoke system. And quite often, the hub becomes transparent to the learner, and L&D becomes interested in the learning record store, and the learner can actually learn when they naturally need to learn, like on YouTube, and they have the option to be able to send that learning back to the learning record store as well. Thank you for everyone for getting to the end of this recording. I've covered a lot of area fairly quickly, none of it really in depth. We've got lots of other webinar recordings that do cover many things like learning transfer and sticky learning and social learning in a lot more depth. Each week I spend a bit of time talking to people who've been along to our webinars. If you're interested in having a chat about how to get started in digital learning, just reply to one of my messages and we can set up a time.